Okay, benvinguts, benvingudes, benvidos, benvidas, welcome. Welcome. There's probably some other languages which I don't control. Um, I want to thank the Institut Ramon Llull and the four universities that invited me to this lecture. I will be talking about linguistic diversity and sociolinguistic revolutions, which is a subject I've been dealing with during the last years. Basically, because I think that sociolinguistics cannot be understood without a historical view. And the reason why I focused, or why I have been working on this subject, is that in fact, I'd like to understand what we should be doing right now and in the near future in order to preserve linguistic diversity. And the only way to understand the world where we are living now, in my view, is to look behind and try to understand our diversity with a historical perspective. And linguistic diversity is a complex phenomenon which is based on change, on mobility, which is based on transformation. We know that languages, which are just a behavior produced by human beings, do not stay quiet. They keep changing all the time for a variety of reasons. And we know of processes of linguistic spread and linguistic contraction. Here you've got, for instance, the Bantu migration, which tells us why a great deal of Africa is populated by people who speak Bantu languages, which were not there some 2,000 years ago. Or you also have here the changes in the borders of Basconic languages, or the changes in the borders of Irish in historical times. So we know for sure the languages change not only in their form, but also in their spread. But we know that phenomena which are connected with language reproduction are changing rapidly in our period. What I will be trying to do is I'll introduce a couple of concepts, basically the concept of eco-linguistic revolution, and I will try to understand which have been the main eco-linguistic revolutions in the last many years. So, and we'll ask what's in front of us, okay? And what we can learn from these past eco-linguistic revolutions. And one of the first, well, as has been proclaimed many times, we are probably witnessing a massive extinction of languages. So this is why there's a growing concern about this. So the why and the how a language shift is taking place, it will be central in my conference. When we talk about languages, we should never forget that in fact we are talking about populations. And in fact, we are not only talking about systems. Why? What do I mean by complex ecosystems? I mean systems of populations that live in a particular natural environment, which have a given social structure, which are organized in a political environment and a political structure, which have an ideological and a cultural configuration, and which have a number of technologies. All of them create these complex ecosystems that we call societies, which are the explanation of why languages are reproduced or not reproduced. When Aboriginal nations in Australia, if we want to call them nations to give a modern term, reproduce without problems their languages for many years. That was due basically because their organization allowed for that. Some of those languages already disappeared before Europeans were there, due basically to this complex changes in the social and environmental ecosystems. There are therefore two key concepts I will be retaining. One of them is the concept of eco-linguistic revolution, and the second one is the type of eco-linguistic environment. When I talk about eco-linguistic revolution, I talk about a transformation, an eco-linguistic transformation that reorganizes the ecosystem to the extent that they may destabilize the languages. The reasons for these eco-linguistic revolutions may be very different. I mean, genocide is a drastic eco-linguistic revolution. I mean, you kill all the speakers of a community, of a society. Definitely, that's a revolution. But for instance, when you have diseases, are eco-linguistic revolutions. We've seen a small eco-linguistic revolution with COVID, in the sense that we have all learned to communicate differently. We have jumped into technologies, and we are doing a number of things that we were not doing 2 years ago. I mean, 2 years ago, probably we would have organized this conference, this lecture, in a presential way. I would have been invited to fly to one of those cities. I'm not inviting myself, but that's my experience. I would have been invited, and the composition of the audience would have been different. This is obviously something that has an impact on language practices. Just to give you an example, it's been noticed that in Catalonia, some people that were giving yoga lessons, or that were giving other lessons in Catalan presentially, suddenly switched to Castilian to make a global class. Some of them then went back to Catalan because they realized that they were suffering from a global competition, and the fact of adopting a global language was not giving them more audience. But that's part of the game. We don't know, and we'll talk about that at the end of this talk. So there are plenty of reasons for eco-linguistic revolutions: demographic, political, technological, economic, ideological, and cultural. And of course, the eco-linguistic dynamics are different depending on the type of society, the linguistic ecosystem. Then what I suggest is that we look at different sorts of societies from a sociolinguistic perspective, which obviously is not only a linguistic perspective. I will not be talking about Indo-European languages or about Camito-Semitic languages. I'll be talking about sorts of societies that organize their linguistic resources in particular ways. And the first type of society that we should consider is, of course, societies that do not have a written language. I mean, agrarian societies whose language is normal, if you want, in the sense that all languages started are normal oral languages, except for sign languages, of course. These societies may have different structures. They may be hunters and gatherers, they may be shepherds, they may live on agriculture, and of course, all of these different ways of earning their lives imposes a number of restrictions. For instance, hunters-gatherers usually are smaller groups, and they are not very fond of private property, because if you have to carry your properties, I mean, it is tiresome to move away with lots of things. On the contrary, agricultural societies have more private property, because you live somewhere, you remain there. But from the point of view of language, these societies may share the fact that they don't need to create a written model of language, and they pass perfectly without it. And there's a major change. We never remember that change. And Harari, the historian or philosopher or thinker, I don't know if you've read *Sapiens*, but if you haven't read *Sapiens*, this summer you already have an appointment. Read *Sapiens*. Okay, he reminds us a lot that one of probably the first ecolinguistic revolution. He does not use this term, but I apply it to it. Was cognitive revolution, when we people learn to create narrative and figurative language, when we created stories that helped us give reasons and explanations to the world, we radically modified our species. We started understanding the world in a way that our ancestors were not able to understand, because we had causes and consequences and actors. This is the first ecolinguistic revolution. As far as we know, all human beings experienced that revolution, so we don't know what human beings would be without that revolution. But if we move one step beyond, some 1,000 years ago, a number of societies started developing into a different sort of organization, political, economic, and we'll see sociolinguistic organization. I'm talking about state. At a given point, agricultures and shepherds discovered that if they organized in some ways, they were able to achieve some goals. For instance, if you organize yourself in a way that you can subsidize an army, you may defend yourself, a part-time army, but you defend yourself better than when you cannot subsidize it. Or if you can subsidize priests that ask gods to help you, gods may help you better than if you don't have those priests. At least that's what they believed at that moment. So that's the basis or the origin of states, ancient states, and even Middle-aged states, which from a sociolinguistic point of view, I think are quite similar. The creation of the state led to a lot of changes. But for instance, I don't know if you recognize this statue. Just have a look at it carefully. Do you think that what do you think about this statue? Who do you think she was? It's something we have to organize. Any guess about who she was? That's the Lady of Elche, which is a city in southern Valencian country. And as usual, the statue is not in the Valencian country, but in Madrid. That's not a coincidence. But it was created, done before the Valencian country in Madrid existed. She was probably a rich, and the important part of it is rich, owner, or the wife of a rich owner, or she was perhaps a priest. We don't know exactly, but what we know perfectly is that she lived in a society which already had social classes, because as you can see, she is dressed in a very rich way. Not everybody was dressed in the same way. Probably not her slaves. She probably had slaves, and not the people that the women that were going to the fields to produce food to feed her. Okay, so this state, by the way, I don't know if you ever realized Did you ever notice that there's a science that is called the science of state? Think, which science is that? The science of state. Basic science of state. Yes, I see it on your faces. It is statistics. Why? Because the first thing that happened when you create a state is that there's someone who wants to count how many cows or pigs or hens or how many acres of land you have, because you are condemned to pay taxes. And you can't have a proper report of the taxes you have to pay if you don't have mathematics, which at the beginning are statistics. And you need something else apart from mathematics. I mean, think about yourself. What sort of numbers can you multiply just by head? Numbers with 3 figures, 4 figures, 10 figures. How many numbers can you include there? Oh my God, just imagine you are a rich woman, like a rich lady like that, and you want to know how many pigs you will be getting. But can you do that by heart? No, you can't. What do you need? You have to write it down. So those are the 2 major changes with the creation of the states. First, states were, city-states, for instance, the Iberian states or the ancient Greek states. You know that fantastic film where this guy kicks the bad guy into a hole, saying, "This is Sparta." Okay, that was one state, a city-state, fighting against an ancient state, which was Persia. Both of them were states. Okay, a city-state. You had some pre-modern national states like ancient Egypt or Japan, or the states of the Crown of Aragon were pre-national states. And you had also empires. So there's a big variety of ancient and Middle Age states, but they shared a number of elements. They intensified trade, they improved the technology of trade, they invented coins, and they produced, or they came hand in hand with the second Ecolinguistic Revolution, writing. In order to keep records, I mean, I know that we would have preferred to think that writing started with poetry. Sorry, poetry was previous, and we only thought about, and by the way, poetry was an art technology. Poetry was created to retain more easily stories. If you learn poems by hand, by heart, it's easier to retain stories. I met a guy from Somalia who told me he could explain me his family up to 70 generations before. And she knew that by heart. I don't know if that was true. I never tried it, but she claimed he could. So the interesting thing is that you will see there's some Catalan in my slides. I did not have the time to go through all of them in the end for a number of reasons, but so enjoy diversity. So what sort of sociolinguistic changes were produced by this ecolinguistic revolution? Well, trade encouraged lingua franca, and for instance, Greek or Phoenician spread with trade. And states created demolinguistic reorganizations. Rome, ancient Rome, was a city of more than 1 million people. And it was a multilingual and multicultural and multi-ethnic and multi-whatever you want. If you have read Asterix and Obelix as a legionnaire, you know that. And it's quite a good reference. For instance, these states produce, for instance, Latinization or Sinization. They, of course, they reduced languages to writing. Just think of the amazing feeling that people who could not write had when they saw those giant monuments with inscriptions there, and they knew that what was written there would never go away. Think of Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's amazing. I mean, they may have been written 4,000 years ago, and they're still there. So the things that were said, were written, are there. And that gives prestige to a number of varieties which were reduced to writing and not to others. Some languages were standardized. Sanskrit, for instance, when I discovered this, it was quite funny. Sanskrit literally means unified, standardized. In fact, the name of the language is Sanskrit Bhasha, so standard language. Why? Because it carries, the old Vedas carry a lot of knowledge, and that knowledge had to be preserved in a standardized way that could pass from generation to generation. And that means that some languages became vehicles to written knowledge. You could access lots of knowledge if you learned Sanskrit. You could access lots of knowledge if you learned Latin or ancient Chinese, standard Chinese. Most people were not really interested in getting to those information, but those languages were already a linguistic capital, which were valued and valuable for that, because they were doors to often sacred and revered knowledge. Okay, so you see the difference between the previous societies and these societies. Just to give you an example, I never found a map of languages in the low Middle Ages in Europe, but if we have a look at some language of minoritized varieties, they can give us a good idea of what Europe might have looked or sounded, in fact, in the 14th or 16th century. I'm not saying that the map reproduces exactly that situation, but it is closer to that situation than the map of official languages. What you see here is a lot of varieties. Asturian or Leonese is there, Aragonese is there, and in fact, plenty of the varieties that here are shown with just one color should be broken into very different varieties. What happened during the Middle Ages is a quite well-known process that happened among many varieties. First, you had individuation, for instance, from all Latin or from all Slavonic or from all Germanic varieties. You had the individuation of a number of languages. Many of them went through a process of progressive codification, and many of them occupied progressively formal and official domains, and quite a lot of them became intellectualized. They became used for things that were higher knowledge, written and formal knowledge. And this is a process followed by Portuguese, by Castilian, by French, by English, but also by Catalan, Frisian, Irish, Venetian, and other varieties that were codified, etc., etc. What happened? Well, we had another revolution, and the new revolution was connected with the modern state. I spoke about ancient and Middle Ages states. Now I am talking about the modern age state. What's the change? What are the changes? In these revolutions, you have plenty of changes taking place simultaneously, and it's probably the coincidence of many of them that creates the revolution. So this ecolinguistic revolution combined first changes in linguistic technologies. The printing press was created, and that is a fundamental, that's something that in Germany you know very well, that created a fundamental change. in the life of languages. Why? Just think of yourself as someone who wants to produce a copy of a book before the printing revolution, the printing press. Well, you would buy the book and order a guy, basically a guy. Women were not allowed to do that. And then that person would copy by hand. And it would take, I don't know, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. The guy copying would allow himself licenses. Just to give you an example, I don't know. I mean, since there are no British or US citizens here, we can confess one thing: we never know if we have to write stabilization with Z or with S. We don't know, and we know it's a chaos. Okay. And some people write theater with an R before the E, or with an E before the R. That's complex. If you are the guy copying a book, you can use your preferences. And who's going to complain? No one. That means that if you speak a different variety, you may introduce different changes. Perhaps your subjunctive is different from the subjunctive written on the original version. And perhaps you prefer a word which is instead of Okay. That changes with printing press. Why? Because you make one copy. You prepare 1 page and then you print it 500 times. I mean, as many as you can. Why? Because you want to sell as many as you can. That's your business. And that introduces 2 basic changes. One of them is that you standardize. I mean, you try to, you stop producing your own varieties. You want to sell that to the biggest possible audience. So you will try to converge towards a variety that offers you profit. Okay. So this technological revolution coincided with ideological revolutions also, reform and counter-reform, religious. When Luther started to distribute his teachings and his thoughts, he was not the first one to do that. There had been lots of reformers during the previous centuries, but he found that gift from God, as he said once, which was the printing press. He could distribute very rapidly, very fast, his thoughts in a few weeks. What he had written in German could be read all over Germany. That was the internet of the moment. But why did he write in German? Basically because there had been a change, in an ideological change. If you believe that individuals have the right to get in touch directly with the word of God, then you need to provide either extensive education in the language of God, or a translation of the language of God into the language of the people. Okay? And since Protestants were not reformers, were not in a position to spend years and years teaching Latin to the population, the best thing to do was to use a language that could be understood by the population. And that's what the Protestants did all over Europe, in Sweden and Denmark, in England, in Wales, etc., etc. Actually, that had happened before. For instance, the Bible had been translated into Catalan, and the Bible was totally translated into Catalan, but you had another ideological factor going on at that moment. Catholic Church did not share the same idea as Luther and the Protestants. The Catholic Church believed that every single person was in need of being led towards a correct interpretation of God's words, which means that it was better not to give them translated versions. It was better to prepare some people to be able to read Latin and to understand properly God's teachings. So what the Catholic Church did was it prevented the use of vernacular languages for for religious issues. Okay, that's the origin of one of the major divisions in Europe for centuries. In Protestant countries, you had a very high degree of literacy, versus in Catholic countries, you had a very low level of literacy. Sorry, there's also, the corrector, the word speller made some nasty things here. And there was also another revolution which was going on. The modern national states, some of the feudal states accumulated more and more power, and there was a race towards more and more absolutist government. So you had Castile became more and more absolutist and started prefiguring Spain. France did the same. England, Denmark, Sweden. So if you have political centralization, the need of a standard language to spread your products, and the promotion of vernaculars, the consequence of that is that you have first explicit language policies, like the edict of Villers-Cotterêts, which said stop using Latin and use only French whenever you want to write an official document in France. Or the Académie Française, let's create an organization that standardizes the language. Or you have, at the beginning of the 18th century, the decrees of new plant, which make a step into introducing Castilian into the non-Castilian speaking countries of the empire, of the Spanish Empire. And you also have a wave of language codification. Some languages were codified. Some languages had the Bible translated into them. So the sociolinguistic results of that revolution was, on the one hand, you had the establishment of the languages of the modern states. Many modern states had their language established as the official language. Castilian, French, English, Danish, Italian in some areas, etc. Then you had, that led to aristocratic diglossia. People on top of social classes in areas which did not speak the language of power learned them to be in contact with the capital and with the power, and to distinguish themselves from the rest of the population. You had the spread of literacy, and at the same time, you had process of minoritization or dialectalization and patoisization of languages that up to that moment had been normal, that it had been the normal vehicle of communication of their societies. So Occitan, which used to have the first standardized language among Romance languages, was less and less used in a unified form, and it became progressively felt as a bunch of dialects, and after that, bunch of patois. And you had that with Low German, with Frisian, with Irish, with Norwegian, etc. Fourth model, a contemporary modern state. With the Fourth Revolution, you have two basic elements: nationalism and industrialization. And You have a new sort of state, the contemporary nation state. When we talk about nationalism, we sometimes forget the basis of that concept. Just think of the opposition between absolute states. Okay, you had absolute states in the 18th century, and an absolute state meant that there was a king who was the sovereign and who had all the power, and like Louis the 14th could say things like, the state is me. Or as in Castilian, it say, la palabra del rey es ley. So the king's word is the law. In opposition to that, when nationalism starts, what's nationalism at that moment? It is the idea that sovereigns are not the depositories of sovereignty. It is the nation which is sovereign, and it is the nation that has to decide. Just think of the American Constitution. It says, we the people. Look, this is a fundamental revolution. It's not we the servants of a king. No, we the people decide this and this and that. Okay, we know that we the people meant older white males, okay? But the idea, the basic idea is that you take away sovereignty from the king and distribute it among the nation. Then the problem is obviously, what is the nation? I mean, who are the members of the nation who are allowed to share part of that sovereignty? So since the end of the 18th century, we see a process which has not stopped yet of giving, or if you want, devolving sovereignty towards the people. This change was combined with industrialization and with a lot of social changes that you know, meritocracy, urbanization, rise of bourgeoisie, the rise of the apparition of proletariat, and the creation of the 19th and 20th centuries. Look, if you want to be a nation which decides its own future, you want communication among your citizens. That means that all citizens need to share information, and there you have mass media, newspapers that explain things about how things are going, and you need universal literacy. And that's a great moment to spread your national language, which is the language that someone has decided that is the language of the nation. Okay? Some fundamental ethnolinguistic changes. Look, this is Barcelona in the year at the beginning of the 19th century. Sorry, the 20th century. Look clearly at the street and now compare it with this one. What differences can you see there in linguistic terms? Is there any difference? Don't you see any linguistic difference?
Al xat la Laura ha escrit només veig Coca-Cola, que m'ha escrit el...
No només Coca-Cola. I Pirelli. And what else? And the motorbike has a number which is written, and there are other ads at the end. There are posters. How many posters, how many written signs do you see in the first picture? None. During the 20th century, we invented written landscape. And it became so natural for us that we don't see it. We don't even realize that it was not there. We create, it's like creating a new apartment, or a new if you think about a house, you create a new house, a new flat. We could speak, we could write, but now we've got written language on the walls. And we created, I mean the human species, of course, we created spoken radio. I mean, radio is always spoken, but radio introduced in your kitchen a language. Up to that moment, to give you an example from Catalonia, Castilian was the language that was used only in formal situations such as some classrooms or in some official offices. So the contact that normal people had with the language of the state was minimal. I mean, they didn't hear, I don't say understand, hear the language until they met a Guardia Civil, for instance. And then you had two monolinguals speaking the local language and the language of the state, and they didn't understand each other very often. But that changed in the 20th century. Oh, not only with the official language, you also had the Beatles, to give you an example. We could have music in our houses, and you had television and cinema. A relative of mine, who would now be 140 years, more or less, was taken to the cinema in the 70s. She was an old lady from a small village, and when she was asked, did you enjoy it, the cinema, she had never been there, and she said, oh, yes, I liked the film very much. And what did you like the most? I liked the nuns. And then they asked her, the nuns? What nuns? Yes, there were some nuns there, and they were very nice. And then they said, Grandma, we took you to see the 10th Commandments, which happened with Moses, okay? And apparently there was a trailer of another film, which was History of a Nun. And that was the part of the film that she enjoyed the most. You see the distance, okay? And of course, we had more and more universal schooling. So the fifth revolution, so what we had until now, we had national states creating good patriots who learned the national language and who learned that they had to fight and die for the country and learn and speak properly. And think that, let's take France, which is a paradigmatic example. France would tell everybody, France has one language, the rest are dialects. Dialects should disappear. And if you learn French, that's the language of leveling. We'll be all at the same level, we'll share the same language, and we'll be happy. And you can rise towards the apex of social class with French. So get rid of Occitan, get rid of whatever you had, which is not really valuable. In fact, we now I think I speak about the elites and the state. We took care that Occitan was valueless. So listen to your teacher and forget about Basque or whatever you want, or Breton. That was the world where your parents were educated. There was one language, one country, and everything should be done in that language. And if you behave like a good citizen, in the end, well, you would have a happy end, of course. But then we had another revolution, this fifth Ecolinguistic Revolution, which is connected with globalization and with communication and information technologies. When did it start? Well, some people would say that around the Mauer fall. It's obviously connected with the internet, the development of the internet, and it has to do also with this process of creating a global market, just one market. Do you know where your t-shirts, the t-shirt you are wearing now, do you know where it was produced? It may be Vietnam, or it may be any other place in the globe. Globalization creates a single market and encourages this sort of homogenization of parts of the economic life. And of course, globalization goes beyond most nation states. Most nation states cannot oppose Google, and they cannot oppose Facebook. They don't have the ability, the capacity to resist Twitter. In economic terms, we human beings are trying to see how we can make Amazon pay taxes as the rest of mortals. Okay, and we don't find a way to do it. And there's also a new organization of power. Some powers become more and more powerful. China is already the second most important power in the world. You know, the places like Turkey are becoming more and more important in geostrategic terms. And we move and keep moving and keep moving. Well, we used to move, and we used to go on holidays to very distant places. That means that we human beings, we are more and more in contact with each other, be it face-to-face communication or in the internet communication. And there are plenty of people movements. There are millions of people from Syria that were forced to go away from their country, and which have been moving to other places. And this has dramatic consequences in sociolinguistic terms. And we human beings live now more in big cities than in small towns and villages. For the first time in history, most of the human race lives in a big city, in a city. What are the consequences? Here you've got a nice picture I took in Munich. You see, you are walking across Munich and you find advertisements like this one in several languages. If you've got a pain in your teeth, you can rush to that dentist, if you understand some of these languages, of course. Okay, so we've got mobility, which means that recent diversity grows locally, okay? And we've got globalization, which means that the value of lingua francas grows. And we've got the society of information, which commodifies linguistic knowledge. Some varieties are valuable. Some of them are cool and they help you go into a number of areas. Others are relevant if you want to become a researcher. Others are needed because you want to teach a language in your country of origin. We had this article published recently about Chinese in Catalonia learning Catalan, saying, no, I want, there are some places in China and Chinese universities will prefer Chinese people who can speak Catalan properly. So I'm getting prepared to run for those posts in China. Okay, this is commodification of linguistic knowledge. And we have changed our perception about bilingualism. For a French, I give you a personal example. In the 80s, I met a very nice French girl. She was gorgeous, okay? She was, I was trying to talk to her, okay, with my poor French. She was from southern Catalonia. She didn't speak Catalan, but at a given point, she said in French, luckily, I don't understand that. What she was saying is, luckily, I got rid of that mark of being a peasant and I'm part of modernity. And being bilingual was not cool. Well, I think we will share the idea that bilingualism is right now looked in a different way. So ideologies have changed. And right now, there are plenty of what we call policy, identity politics. We individuals want to be recognized as what we are, and we want to be able to define what we are. And we have that not only in languages, in sexuality and gender, in race, in whatever you want. Identity politics is much more important now than it used to be. And we don't want to discriminate people because of their identity. France, again, now a nice thing about them. France has just passed a law that makes illegal and punished by law to discriminate someone on the basis of his or her accent. So if you have a southern accent and you don't get a post and you think that it is because they rejected you because of the accent, you can go to court. And if you prove that, you can work, you can win. Okay? And of course, the linguistic technologies are growing and growing and growing. You all have this monster next to you, okay, which is replete with technologies. I have read the programs of universities in Afghanistan. I'm not sure in what language they were written, okay, but I know what they said. This is fantastic. It's incredible. This is changing our world. It is so incredible that I would say that we are witnessing the 6th sociolinguistic revolution or ecolinguistic revolution. Here you have one guy that became very popular when he's in Catalonia, when he said that I want to speak Catalan with my toaster. And say, what? That was a pun, of course, a joke. But what he was saying is that if you want your language to reproduce into future, you need that your language gets into this linguistic revolution. You need to create the technologies that allow you to interact with language with machines. So I don't know if you've seen there's a wonderful video from Schiphol Airport. If you write automatic translation Schiphol Airport, and you'll see people sitting in 2 different sofas, in fact, with this microphone. One of them is speaking in Finnish to a Mexican child who's hearing the discourse in Castilian, Spanish. And then another one who speaks in Japanese with someone from a different place. This is another revolution. I would say that it is the 6th one. Why? Because I don't know if you are friends with Cortana or with Siri or with whatever artificial intelligence you want to get acquainted with. But we are talking with machines, but we are talking with machines in a number of languages. If we want that to be democratic, egalitarian, we need to introduce as many languages as possible. But this is changing our world. So I suggest two issues for the future. One of them is, are we really moving towards a new ecolinguistic paradigm? And second, the idea of digital irrelevance or digital minoritization, languages that are kept away from technologies will probably follow the path of languages that were kept away from written language. That's something I think that it is an issue to be discussed. Okay, we know that right now, I spoke in as if all revolutions took place at the same time. That's not true. In some places in the world, people are still living as agrarian societies without a written language. In other places, they are seeing the Industrial Revolution and the nation state, and in other places, they are seeing the entrance into this new paradigm. And in fact, in some places, they are moving directly from agrarian societies to this technological world. So we've got plenty of questions. Will societies of hunters and gatherers survive? Do they have any possibility of survival unless we, the rest of the human beings, agree that they have the right or privilege, I don't know, not to be disturbed by their brethren? I mean, this is something that is being debated, for instance, in Brazil. What do you do with uncontacted tribes? We may also discuss about an incipient minorization in the process of establishing of new national states, and what's going on with languages that were minoritized and are now finding new rights. So, and I will be finishing here. We still don't understand the consequences of this new linguistic ecosystem. For instance, to give you an example, in some areas of Africa, the population seems to be moving from being an agricultural or a shepherd society into a new society which with mobile phones. And for instance, they have kept computers, so they have jumped from one not even written language into mobile phones. So how are we going to organize all of this? So it's high time to start the debate. Thank you a lot for your attention, and well, I'm at your disposal. So whatever you want to discuss or ask, the floor is yours.
Wow, Xavier, thanks a lot. Really difficult now because you have explained a lot of things, and now at the end, lots of questions, and I think we are like waiting for your conclusion or that you say something relevant, and now we are all thinking and thinking and thinking. In the chat,
that's good.
That's good. That's really good. But I was just waiting. Okay, and now what's the proposal, Xavier? What will we have to do? How can we follow now?
Let's first go into the questions.
Yeah.
I've got my own ideas, of course, but let's go into the questions if there are some, because I was not following the chat.
There's not a lot of things you can follow just now. Only Estefania said about another example of now when you were talking about Siri and Cortana. She just wrote Alexa would be another example.
Alexa. Yeah, of course.
We did had a British student. He just left, but he was just right. I'm British. It was I don't see it now, but I think I don't want to tell him
joking about spelling.
The spell, just no. Okay, and then at the moment when you were explaining or talking about, I don't know, it was the third revolution or the fourth, I'm lost.
Yes.
But then Fabio from Brazil wrote in Portuguese and in English that it was interesting for him to compare and to imagine the processes of catechizing indigenous people in the 16th century in Brazil, where the Jesuits had to use methods of philological linguistic understanding to interpret and translate Tupi Guarani.
Yes.
I'm not sure in what moment he wrote the reflection, but that was all until now.
Well, if Fabio,
Fabio.
In fact, the Jesuits in Paraguay acted like a state, but they did not follow the same direction as the Portuguese king or the Castilian king, because they used Guarani, they standardized Guarani, and they transformed a language that was used for in non-urbanized society. It was transformed into a language which could be used in the reducciones, which was much more similar to a European society. But thanks to that, Guarani became the language of communication, and it survived independence and establishment of a new state. And it is one of the most healthy languages in America, originally languages. So yes, it is a fascinating case.
Mm-hmm. Now you have indeed 3 comments or questions.
Okay.
Xavier, Jan, I guess one question on my mind would be, what about language communities with no ambitions to become international?
On purpose, I didn't make a big difference between international languages and non-international languages. If you noticed, especially in the last slides, I was not talking about the hegemony, the necessary hegemony of one language over the others, because there's a debate right now. The debate is, on one side, just imagine that as a boxing combat. On one side, some sociologists and some sociolinguists believe that the process of spread of some international languages will keep moving very fast. Some people have even talked about a stampede towards English, saying, yes, English is going to give to accumulate value and more value, and everybody will want to speak English. And they say at a given point, people will even start using English at home because the prestige of the language, etc., etc. That's one very extreme position. At the other extreme, you've got another position saying that English is going to be the last lingua franca of the human beings. You say, what? Yes, because the next lingua franca is going to be automatic translation. Now think. I'm talking about the 2 extremes, okay? Think. What happened? I mean, let's think about a society that we know with whose members were told for decades, your language is the most spoken language in the world. Everybody wants to learn your language. Your language can lead you everywhere. If we could make this experiment to see what happens in sociolinguistic terms, we would know what happens with hegemony, okay? When your language is hegemonic. Okay, we have that. In the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in Australia, in the United States, people have been told for decades that everybody wanted to learn English. What happened? Interest for other languages decreased. So if you look at the number of people who were able to speak a foreign language in the United Kingdom 40 years ago, or people taking language lessons 40 years ago, the percentages were higher. Which means that when you have something that allows you not to learn a language which is just instrumental, interest in learning foreign languages decreases, okay? Well, this is fascinating, because if we had automatic translation among different languages, the role of lingua franca, just as a lingua franca, the language you must learn, because if you want one day abroad, you meet a foreigner, the role of lingua franca will decrease. Of course, this does not affect the other languages that are not learned as a lingua franca, okay? But some people are claiming that, in fact, interests in just totalitarian language learning might decrease. So you have two completely opposed views. Some people saying that English will become the language, or English and Chinese, and other people saying no, 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 no. In fact, lots of the reasons that promote those languages will decrease. Apart from that, I find it very difficult to believe that interest for languages that is not exclusively instrumental will decrease in the future. What I'm saying is, when you learn a language for cultural affiliation, for interest in people, I mean, when you fall in love, can you imagine yourself falling in love with someone who speaks a different language and saying, "I love you," and the other saying, "Oh yes, so do I"? I find this difficult to believe. Okay, I don't know. Who knows the future? But the discussion regarding lingua francas is really fascinating.
Indeed, there's another comment, Xavier,
Yes.
about this lingua franca. I think we can read it now, and then we go back to the other questions, because there are some different. And Mar Mañez Bordes, our colleague in Vienna, in Wien, writes and says, as a translator, I do not think automatic translation can ever become a lingua franca for oral communication. But if we want to speculate, I would argue for Globish, or a form of English that has calques from other prestige languages. It's an opinion from a translator.
Other people think that. What some people say also is that basic communication will be done through machine, but sophisticated communication will need people. In fact, translators right now are using, I mean, literary translators or technical translation. They are using automatic translation, but they edit, which gives you the speed of automatic translation and the quality of human. So I didn't say I placed myself at one of those extremes. I just mentioned that it is, I mean, future is open. We'll see. That's why
I'm sorry, I have to disagree strongly as a translator, because even though the future of translation, sorry that I interrupt and keep going into this topic.
Be welcome.
But even though it's true that automatic translation or machine-assisted translation, actually is the proper term, is being used more and more often in professional translation, and it's a whole discussion for another day. Machines will never be able to substitute human knowledge and human communication skills, I think. So yeah, but then it's a discussion for another day, probably.
Yes, no, and you're actually not discussing with me. I'm just saying that there are different views of future. And people with an important career behind them are defending different positions, and I find this exciting. So it's not only a discussion; it's a great discussion to talk and sit and talk.
Yeah, indeed. But there are two more comments or two more questions. One of them from Stefania. Do you think it's possible to go back to a previous state once another process or another revolution started?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, it has happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, we have some instances of communities that had reached one state and went to a different state. And I'm thinking about the creation of some Creole languages in the Pacific, where people from European descent and people from Pacific descent, so people from European descent who were able to read and write and came from a society which was organized as a nation state, they created a new society mixed with Pacific people from the Pacific, and then a new language appeared, which was based on the combination of those languages, and there was no written form for the language. They created a society without a nation state that did not require written language. So this has happened, but which means that everything could happen in the future. But I would also say that this is just I mean, a very, 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 very exceptional case.
Mm-hmm.
I find it difficult to imagine that a society would, for instance, give up internet and, for instance, written language.
Mm-hmm. So there are not really lots of examples of those, and difficult to imagine. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Now we have another last question. Some other people, we have still a pair of minutes. You can write or send or open your microphones and ask more things, but the one and the last here from Pere Comellas. Gràcies, molt interessant. Creus que les successives revolucions impacten en les formes lingüístiques?
Sí, sí, sí. Sí, contesto en català?
Com tu vulguis.
Sí, gràcies. Tu ja coneixies una mica de què anava això. Espera, crec que sí que impacten en les formes. A veure, no només impacten en les formes, impacten fins i tot en el cervell de les persones. Quan apareix la lletra escrita, això descarrega la necessitat de memoritzar textos llargs. I les persones que viuen en societats àgrafes sembla ser que tenen més capacitat memoritzen més. I ara ens està passant una mica al contrari. Ara estem passant, fa pocs dies ha sortit una notícia dient que un percentatge molt elevat de candidats a fer de mestre no sabien recordar un llibre que haguessin llegit, que és una cosa que dius, què?
It's real, it's happening at university.
Yeah, I know. Llavors, impacta sobre el cervell de les persones i impacta sobre la llengua. Hi ha gent que parla com si fos un llibre. Hi ha gent que tendeix a utilitzar un vocabulari i a crear unes formes, fins i tot allò sintàctiques, quan està parlant, que és com un llibre. Jo ara mateix estic parlant d'una manera que no crec que parlés si no hi hagués una llengua escrita. Per tant, sí. Sí, sí.
I don't know if all the people were able to understand the question. If someone needs us to translate something, just let us know in the chat or something like that.
I'll just give a short abstract.
Sure.
Dr. Comellas asked me if I thought that that revolutions have an impact on language form, and I said that yes, I'm sure that they have an impact. And I compared societies with and without written language, societies with and without bureaucraties, the language of bureaucrats. It's evident. If you look at the letters written by your grandparents or your grand-grandparents, and you look at them and you think, oh my God, how could they write in this way? Those long romantic sentences. You would never write in that way. But that belongs to a particular moment.
Xavier was also thinking when you were answering and about giving these examples from people who doesn't remember the books or different impacts on the form about all these theories that or the studies already about people looking at children and their capacity to concentrate because they don't really use, or some of them, they are not used to use paper. They are used to use tablets and smartphones to play, to look at stories, and then they have more difficulties to concentrate. I think it's also another example, no?
And this has a consequence, I would say. For instance, if you listen to children that don't read, their way of speaking is probably more slang style than the way of speaking of children who are more used to read. And I realized that some vocabulary that for me was absolutely common. Once I realized that children with troubles with words like observe, observar, they didn't know what that was. And children who were 10 and 11 years old, I thought, I think that at their age, my generation knew that vocabulary.
And that might have consequences in other stages of education to learn, to study, I mean, to understand what you're reading and so on. Mar, do you want to say something? Open your microphone.
Yes, I wanted to add something to this topic of technology, or maybe a question / comment regarding strong and minority languages. Because last year, before COVID started, I was carrying on a study about linguistic uses among young population, people who are between 18 and 30. And one of the questions, I based it on the enquesta dos lingüístics de la població. And one of the questions was, what language do you use the internet? In which language? And most of them said whenever they have to Google information, they do so in bigger languages like English or Spanish mostly. This was in Barcelona. So yeah, my question is a bit along those lines. So do you think it also has an influence on how this learning language levels have decreased?
Yeah. If we focus on the internet, I would say it has two different. We should look at it from two different perspectives. One of it is consuming and production, consumption and production of products, and the other is interpersonal communication. If we look at consumption and production, we see that especially some platforms favor big languages because they incorporate a lot of information, and that even has an impact on people who want to become popular, etc., and make an earning on the internet. By the way, during the pandemics, we published a study about TikTokers and Instagrammers and etc. on the internet, which I recommend to you if you're interested.
I've read it. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's another phenomenon which is not necessarily contradictory. When you look at language practices on the internet for interpersonal communication, what we see is a lot of use of non-standard forms, which in many areas in Europe means that dialects that had been minoritized for centuries which had been denied all sort of recognition, are being used as a written mode of communication for the first time massively in WhatsApp and in other social networks. For instance, we did a study about in Sicily. In Sicily, there is a massive language shift right now. I mean, the generation which is around 20 years old, if I'm not wrong, is the first generation where Italian is the first, the most important first language, and Sicilian is no longer the predominant language, but still there are plenty of Sicilian youngsters using Sicilian in combination with Italy, code switching, all sort of translanguaging forms. So both phenomena can take place at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
A veure, una altra. Com és la
Sí,
literatura?
Xavier, tenim
perdó.
una abans, anterior, perquè he passat
perdó.
l'enllaç de l'estudi
Sí.
i perquè no ens el saltem tenim la del Jonas de Mijan, of Dutch. Maybe it's not really a question, but you made me think about variation within languages. Could it be that languages are becoming more homogeneous with each eco-linguistic revolution? This is to say, will we eventually lose dialects, as an example, if we don't manage to write them and even to use them with machines?
Okay.
That's really interesting, Jonas.
Yeah. Using the term diversity is sometimes very useful and sometimes a little bit confounding, because it means a lot of things. New technologies and new means of communication create new forms of communication, and that creates new slangs and new ways of people getting in touch with each other. And to give you an example, my teenage children use forms of Catalan which are based on English, Mexican, and other languages, and which are not understandable by. If I say ets una danquesa, no one will understand this. I hear it every day. Danquesa comes from dank, and an English adjective which means weird. Okay. That's a sort of diversity that keeps reproducing all the time. And that sort of diversity, in my view, is not in danger, in the sense that it will continue to appear. On the contrary, if we are talking about linguistic systems which are relatively coherent among them, whether we call them minoritized languages, contested languages, dialects, what we have learned until now is that these varieties survived until the nation state, the contemporary nation state, and we know that those varieties were put at stake and in danger by the contemporary nation state. I may be talking about Sicilian or Frisian in the Netherlands. Frisian, in the last years, Frisian has been losing native speakers, and a few years ago, it stopped being spoken by the majority of Frisians as their first language. But you may also project that into Africa or into Asia. So there are plenty and plenty and plenty of these systems, contested languages, dialects, etc., that unless they are given a value, and value means social functions, are in danger. because they were already very endangered by contemporary nation states. And in the new situation, I don't see many elements playing in their favor. So my advice would be, if you want your variety to survive, unless you can create a completely protected environment where you live out, separated from outside influences, unless you can get that, make an effort to make your variety useful in as many platforms as possible.
Gracias, Javier. Thank you. Sorry, I was reading the next questions already and comments. I can only think about Catalan when you talk about those kind of things. And indeed, I was here writing some to ask you, but there are lots of comments, or at least two. And the one related to dialects and varieties, I am jumping from Jan again,
yes.
Regarding the use of dialects and such in newer media, I am always really surprised when Swiss German friends, seeing them regularly, write dialect in emails and messages. That's not a thing in my place at all, not least because young people very overwhelmingly do not speak dialect. You've been in Germany and you've been in Berlin, I guess, and you know the situation about dialects in German.
Yes.
And
yes, and actually Germany is a fascinating place to do research, and the German-speaking area. What I was saying is perfectly adapted to these examples. In Germany, as far as I know, there's a trend towards the reduction in the use of dialects, what are called dialects, which is not followed in Switzerland. If I'm not wrong, the decline of local dialects was even faster in Austria than in most of Germany, as far as I know. But well, the important case here is Switzerland versus Germany. The idea is that in Switzerland, the local varieties have a strong social value. They are used for local communication. They are used and by for not only for as a symbol of identity, but as a marker of belonging to the local community. So if you want to become part of the local team, you have to learn to communicate with the local team. That's a little bit the idea. And if you want, I suggest that we are moving, I like this, we as human beings, we're probably entering a world which will be characterized by strong facilities to move and communicate with people from other places. But I'm interested basically in the move part. We may go on tourism, or we may go for Erasmus, etc., etc. So if we want to preserve linguistic diversity, and simultaneously we want to enjoy our possibility to move from one place to another one, we have to find a way to combine them. Right now, I mean, let's leave our assisted, machine-assisted translation at one side. Right now, that probably means that it is good that we have lingua francas for the purposes of lingua francas, which is for communication in moments where you are passing by a place, you are not staying in a place. Mm-hmm. But we simultaneously should create a new sort of sociolinguistic contract, saying if you want to establish somewhere and you want to be part of the local team, it is also your responsibility to learn the local language. Because this is the only way, not only to preserve diversity, it is also the only way to treat languages in an equal way. I mean, to put it simple, if British and Americans and Australians, English speakers, get a right to live and do whatever they want in any part of the world in English, the encouragement for them to learn the local language will disappear. But at the same time, they will be given a privilege. It will be they will have the privilege of being, if they want so, monolingual. And from the point of view of the species, this is not fair. So I like very much the idea, which has been put forward by several thinkers, that we have to combine the principle of subsidiarity. So for local things, you should do that as much as possible in the local language. And for non-local things, then you can switch to a lingua franca. To give you a practical example, today we are using a lingua franca, okay? That's fine. We are doing something that could not be done in a different language. But I am not claiming that I will stay in Kiel University or in Arrecife, or I am not doing that. I'm doing something which is momentary. Of course, that demands a lot in terms of language competence. We will all have to be plurilingual to a certain extent. But, well, being plurilingual is not that horrible. Don't you think so?
Really nice. It's really nice. Xavier, we'll still have perhaps 5 more minutes, or not really more, because some people have gone because they have other courses, me as well. And I think there are 2 last questions before the others go. I only want to encourage our students, and most of them studying Catalan in Lectorats del Institut Ramon. I want to encourage them to go to Barcelona for an Erasmus stay and to study with you at the Universitat de Barcelona.
You're welcome.
To study and do some research with you. It's because lots of us, we have convened Erasmus with Barcelona. And then we have Iñaki asking you about literatura, com és la literatura, o més aviat el procés creatiu literari en aquesta última època que ens has esmentat. Si recordem l'estreta relació entre llenguatge i literatura, podríem dir que la tecnologia i parlar amb màquines frena el procés de creació literària. Gràcies, he gaudit molt la xerrada. Tothom està dient que moltes gràcies i que molt interessant i que Sie freuen sich interessant und ich bin froh, dass ich dabei war.
Dankeschön.
Com ho veus, el tema de la literatura i la creació?
És una altra conferència.
Sí.
Jo diria que en aquest cas la tecnificació el que fa és obre una porta a noves experiències. És a dir, hi ha moltes possibilitats que no existien.
I nous formats també, no?
Exactament. A veure, Instagram és una forma de literatura, per dir-ho, o TikTok, per poca cosa que hi hagi allà. És una forma de nous llenguatges poètics i permeten moltes coses. Sí que és veritat, jo crec que hi ha una cosa que la tecnologia sí que ens està fent, i abans ho dèiem. Si tots perdem la capacitat de concentració perquè tenim tants estímuls, llegir Guerra i Pau o llegir Crim i Càstig serà més difícil. Jo crec que això sí que es pot posar damunt de la taula. Per tant, que tendirem a produir coses més breus.
Sí, tots llegim coses més breus, m'incloeixo, Tendeixo a llegir moltes coses molt breus i tinc els llibres que em costen de trobar el moment per llegir-me el llibre. Llegeixo un tros, últimament és aquest fenomen, personalment. Bé, l'últim comentari és de la Mar. From my experience in Austria, it's similar to Switzerland. Speaking Hochdeutsch is only for formal situations.
Oh, great. I thought it was the other way around. At least in Vienna, I don't know if that's the case. In Vienna, I would say...
Mark lives in Vienna.
Yeah, but I may be totally wrong.
no sé, no connectant. Nosaltres som aquí al sud d'Alemanya i sí que veiem com va el tema dels dialectes aquí, Raquel, a Baden. La Marta, que com a traductora literària que fa molts llibres juvenils, tampoc no estic d'acord amb els llibres més curts. No? És que, clar, la solució no és escurçar.
De fet, la tendència dels llibres que tradueixo a vegades és de pensar: vols dir que et cal explicar tot això en 500 pàgines? O sigui, potser sóc jo la que li falta la concentració i una història juvenil que estic traduint ara té pel vol de 400 pàgines i penso, doncs amb 200 te m'hauries pogut dir, saps què vull dir? O sigui, i veig que els joves com en diuen, booktubers, ensenyen sempre totxos. D'acord que molts tenen la lletra molt grossa, no? Però són considerablement totxos i no sé si jo amb 17 anys o 15 anys m'hauria llegit allò.
Hi ha gent per tot, Marc?
Jo crec que sí que jo m'hauria llegit. De fet, jo em vaig llegir Joc de Trons per saber què estaven llegint els meus fills. I són allò totxos. Però, i és veritat, potser el que també es produeix és una especialització de mercat. És a dir, aquesta literatura, diguéssim, massiva, ara és o serà patrimoni d'una minoria, al costat de la qual hi haurà unes majories que no llegiran, no ja el totxo, sinó que no llegiran un llibre. No ho sabem, També és veritat que el percentatge de lectors encara ara és superior entre la gent, entre els adolescents, que no pas entre els joves i la gent d'edat mitjana.
Una mica de qüestions positives, informacions positives abans d'acabar. Xavier, vielen Dank, herzlichen Dank. Moltíssimes gràcies, muito obrigada. Thanks a lot for this interesting speech and conversation i debat, que ha sigut una mica de tot. Us recordo pels parlants de català que el proper dilluns a les 6 de la tarda, el dia 21 a les 6, tenim la segona xerrada d'aquest cicle amb la nostra companya Marina Massaguer. Us hem deixat l'enllaç d'Eventbrite per inscriure's, us el torno a copiar, amb el títol Els no parlants de català en les dinàmiques sociolingüístiques de Catalunya. Tots els que estudieu català o parleu català us hi podeu inscriure, que segur que tenim també moltes preguntes per fer-li a la Marina i moltes coses interessants per escoltar. Moltíssimes gràcies. Aquí només tens gràcies, Xavier.
Moltes gràcies a tots.